This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our with Jim Morrison for the end of the novel, because this is the last chapter, guys. It's over. This is it. Fun fact about that song, my friend Eric Streeter, who is one of my best friends in high school, which means I actually haven't talked to him in like 10 years because that's how life works. He was convinced that that song was some sort of evil omen. He woke up to that song playing on his alarm clock radio like 3 nights in a row or something, he claimed, and it freaked him out. Anyway, I was going to play a song about it being the end of the novel on my ukulele, but then I realized that song was just too perfect not to just use. All right, end of the book, 1965. Craziness here. I just realized I don't have my book on me. I think it's under the couch though, right here. Am I right? Sure is, because I keep everything in the couch right now. Let's talk about the quiz. So we jump forward 24 years to 1965, which I think is like symbolically an interesting choice by Morrison too, because she goes from 1941 to 1965, and the years in between those, in a lot of ways, are some of the most important years in the civil rights movement, and some of the years where we see the most growth in terms of equal rights for people of color in this country. To 1965, which is like at probably the height of the civil rights movement in terms of time around then, because 63 is the 1963 is the death of JFK. 68 is the death of Martin Luther King. We're kind of in between a super turbulent time in the United States for everybody, but definitely hitting like the fever pitch of the civil rights movement and lots of crazy stuff happening in that world around the country. So I just think it's like, even though she doesn't talk directly about any of those things necessarily, it still feels like a really interesting choice to me. And I think also you get that the very first line of the chapter, things were so much better in 1965, period. And you go, or so it seemed, which I think to me talks about this mood of like, things are getting so much better. It seems like things are getting so much better. You've got passage of the Civil Rights Act and things like that have happened. Or it seems like they're getting better, right? Like, is life really getting better for people of color or not is the question. And I think it's like very unfortunately a question that we still ask today. Let's get to this. Where's Nell at the beginning of the chapter? She's going to visit Eva in that, well, what was a brand new old folks home in 1941, probably not so new now. That's where she heads. Yeah. Next question. Sorry, I'm like listening to my kids take a bath in the other room too, and it's tough. I'm sure you guys at home are struggling with similar stuff where like you try to do work, but there's another thing happening in your house that you have no control over, and you're just like, I do this. What does Eva say to Nell that upsets her? Well, Eva is. I feel like this is the Eva that we had back in the beginning of the book, where it just seems like she kind of says stuff to mess with people. Like if you think back to the conversation between Hannah and Eva back in the chapter where Hannah dies, just felt like she was kind of messing with Hannah at times in that chapter, and you get a similar thing here on page 167. Because it seems at first like Eva is totally with it. She like remembers Nell's dad's name. She says Nell Green. She says, Wiley Wright's girl. You do remember. That makes me feel good, Miss Peace. You remember me and my father. But then she goes straight from that line to tell me how you killed that little boy. Which is interesting because I think we as readers sort of assume that only Nell and Sula knew about the death of Chicken Little all along. And all along, Eva knew about it. And Eva does have this interesting place in the book where she has this sort of, there's the connection to Eve, the biblical Eve. She's the first woman in some ways in the book, but also like she does seem to have this weird almost omnipotency to her. And by that, I mean like she's very like this all powerfulness, almost deity like thing about her. Like she's outlived all these other people. She's still going and she knows these things. How does she know these things? Um, so it's interesting. Um, and then we don't know. Like she one point says, "Plum, sweet Plum, he tells me things." To answer the question, though, the thing obviously that gets her upset is that she killed Chicken Little, um, which gets Nell to thinking, though, too. Well, one more interesting thing before we get to that next question is the way when Eva talks to Nell implies several times like Nell, Sula, same person, no difference. Which is a thing that Morrison was doing earlier in the novel a lot when they were younger. It was this idea that they were inseparable, two sides of the same coin, however you want to put it. Um, but we think of them, I think, at this point as diverting quite a bit. I think what Morrison wants us to ask is, have they really? Um, so yeah, it's a question. There's lots of questions this book raises without answers. You got to answer them for yourself. Next question, though. True or false? Nell refuses to believe that she might have enjoyed watching Chicken Little drown. False. um, on page 170, she says, what did old Eva mean by you watched? How could she help seeing it? She was right there. But Eva didn't say see. She said watched. I did not watch it. I just saw it. But it was there anyway. It had always been. The old feeling and the old question, the good feeling she'd had when Chicken's hand slipped. She hadn't wondered about that in years. Why didn't I feel bad when it happened? How come it felt so good to see him fall? So she realizes at the time, not only is she like refused to believe it, she knows deep down that when it happened, she kind of enjoyed it a little bit, which is interesting too. Um, at the end of the book, then, at the end of the book, uh, she says, "We was girls together." The thing I was trying to get to here is, and there's context clues later at that same part. Um, But before she says that, she says, all that time, I thought I was missing Jude. And the loss pressed down on her chest and came up into her throat. We was girls together. The thing she's realizing is what she really missed all those years was Sula. Like ever since their friendship was torn apart by Sula um, having an affair with Jude, um, she's been, that's the thing. If you think of that, like that gray ball that followed her around, in some ways, that I think is maybe then a symbol for that loss, her friendship um, with Sula, which is one of the oldest things in her life in a lot of ways. So there's the answers to those questions. Let's see what questions you guys have. I hope that my kids aren't so loud that you like can't hear me, but I probably should find a quieter place to make these videos. I will. If Nell was thrilled with Chicken Little's death, why didn't she show that emotion at the moment when it happened? It's an interesting question, but I also think we don't, in that moment, we get Sula's perspective is really whose we get. We get her freaking out. We get her running up to Shadrach, but what we really get is her perspective. We never really get Nell's perspective then. And Sula's so freaked out that I don't think she's really paying attention to how Nell's reacting. So we don't really see how she's reacting in the moment. I think what we do know is she does not freak out the way Sula freaks out, which to me is kind of the more natural reaction, is to kind of freak out. Nell doesn't freak out. Nell's super calm. And I think, she talks in this chapter about how she just thought she was being calm, but really it was like she kind of enjoyed it. So I think part of the reason, though, that we didn't see that emotion in that chapter was that we don't get Nell's perspective then. We just get Sula's perspective. Why does Eva think that Nell and Sula were the same when both women took different paths in their life? I think that's what I was just talking about a little bit. I think the interesting thing is, yes, they took different paths, but did they end up in any different of a place? Is the real question. Both end up in the bottom. Um, Nell will probably never leave. Sula left, but she dies there. Um, and I also there's a couple of the essays that kind of talk about the relationship between Sula and Nell in an interesting way. Um, but I mean, they shared the same man at one point, whether Nell wanted that to happen or not. And I think in a way they like completed each other. I think that is partly why Nell is so overcome with sadness and sorrow. The circles and circles of sorrow is what the book says at the end, is because it's this realization, or maybe like remembrance, that the thing that most completed her in life, the person who she was like most alive with, the most herself with, was Sula, not anybody else. And it didn't happen. Like their relationship ended and she didn't get to have that. So I think all of those connections, and I think Sula has a similar thing where I think Sula is or was of the most complete of a person when she was with. Now I even think like there's the end of the 1940 chapter when Sula dies, and the first thing she thinks is, I can't wait to tell Nell about this, right? What is the significance of the bottom becoming a golf course? I think it's a sign. Um, I mean, to me, like golf course is pretty much a sign of like white middle classness, white upper middle classness. So of course, a place that was once special to a generation of black people is now just being erased and turned into a golf course by a bunch of middle class white people. And I think that's part of like the things were getting better, or so it seemed. Like, is that really better in the end? Like that this community is sort of being broken up in a way, and now there is no center for the black community in this area. I think that's a thing that was happening a lot in the early and middle 1900s, where I think black communities were kind of being forced to break up or to move to different places, in a way that's happening here. So I think the golf course is a sign of that, like progress, but is it really progress? And progress led by white middle class people, uh, certainly not by people of color. What do the oranges mean, or is Eva just crazy? So I think an interesting thing about the oranges is probably in the Bible. There's the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which Eve eats. Now, modern interpretations of the Bible always refer to it as an apple. There's no reason to think it was necessarily an apple. The Bible, like no literal transition of the Bible says it was an apple. It just says it's a fruit, basically. Um, so some interesting things to think about here. Plum, which is your son's name, also a fruit that grows on a tree. Oranges, also a fruit that grows on a tree. So you can kind of tie any fruit that grows on a tree to that sort of biblical idea. I'm going a little bit on a deep end here, but stick with me for a second. Um, One of the things I wonder about in this book is I think the death of Chicken Little is a little bit of an original sin kind of thing for uh, Nell and Sula, in that like their innocence is kind of gone from that point. Um, so I just wonder if it's meant to make us think about all those things. Eva's connection to biblical Eve, this idea of original sin, all these things are kind of wrapped up in that. And again, I think when we get into modern literature, like we get to with Toni Morrison, these symbols aren't always so directly connected. Like an author will often just kind of throw these things in there to make us think about that for a second, not because it's a direct relationship between, like, it's not that that orange is definitely supposed to be the biblical fruit, but I think it's maybe supposed to make us think of it. And then when we apply that thinking to the rest of it, like kind of what do we come out with, is I think what's supposed to happen. When Shadrach is passing out at the cemetery, the author says that he was on his way to Sunnydale. Could it be possible that this was when he told Eva, ooh, hmm. There's also an interesting thing, you know, that's whoever wrote this question. I'm gonna figure it out, but I like this question. And I think you could support this question in an interesting way. So on page 160, she says, Plum, sweet Plum, he tells me things. And that makes you think that Eve is going crazy. But you know who would be about the same age as Plum would be then? Shadrach. They both fought in the war, both came back. Like they have that in common. So that's an interesting thought there. And then that goes back to their chapter. Like, did Shadrach know the whole time? Because it doesn't seem like he knew, but maybe he knew. Um, that's an interesting interpretation that you could back up there. That maybe it is Shadrach who told Eva about what happened. For sure, totally. In your opinion, why did Morrison end the book the way she did? Why did she? I really like the end of this book a lot, especially that last sentence. It was a fine cry, loud and long, but it had no bottom and it had no top, just circles and circles of sorrow. There is an essay about Sula called Circles and Circles of Sorrow. It's a really long one. Um, I probably have a copy of it someplace if somebody wants to read it, but I think part of what Morrison is trying to get at a little bit is just like oh cool, somebody's opening a gate someplace. So it's the mail person. So my dog's gonna bark. Go for it. Go for it. You want to see my crazy dog? Here he is. There he is. Yeah, go away, Wallace. It's fine. Go sit down. Go lay down. Do you see why I hate my dog? Anyway, I think some of what Morrison is talking about is just sort of the sorrow of maybe the Black experience in America for most of American history. That's a little bit big, but I think also just like all the characters in this book experience so much sadness in their lives. And it's something that would have been a part of daily life for Black people in America during this time. It's like this constant promise of things getting better, but then this realization that they're not, or not in the way that you were promised they would get better. And I think in some ways, I don't know where I'm going with this, but that's a thing. And I think it just like the book has to end with Sula in some way. Her name is the title of the story, so it'd be weird if it didn't. But I think it's interesting with all the relationships in the book, everything that's happened, that still when it comes to the end of the book, Nell realizes that Sula was the most important relationship in her life. That's an important thing to me. I don't want to say too much more than that, but I'm maybe think on that and add that to questions about the book later this week. What role does Shadrach play in the book? Yeah, what role does he play in the book? He's interesting because he's an observer of a lot of things. And I think in this chapter, he's like another reminder of that, of the death of Chicken Little, which to me is like Nell and Sula's loss of innocence, like their original sin, and a thing that sort of forever binds them together. So in a weird way, like Shadrach also binds them together. But then the other thing is like Shadrach, for what he is like, is kind of binds that whole community together. If you think about the way National Suicide Day becomes part of the fabric of that community, and the way people talk about Shadrach, which is like crazy, but also sort of reverential. I think in some ways Shadrach to me is maybe like the heart of the community in some ways. He's definitely like the only male character in the book that I think we're meant to sort of respect and think of as like a full person, even if he is damaged in so many ways. So those are some of the things I think, and that's one thing I'll think about more and try to add some more about. I'm going to talk more about him when I talk about biblical and literary or biblical and mythical illusion later in the week. Anyway, this video's gotten super long, so I'm going to cut it off here. I hope those were helpful. Probably 2 people are still watching at this point, even with that. But thanks for being here. Thanks for watching this. Thanks for doing all this stuff with us. And thanks for being awesome. And I'll talk to you all soon.